Florida high school principal Dr. George Kenney built a devoted following by hypnotizing students to boost confidence and performance despite not being licensed. But in 2011, 3 teens he had worked with died within months of each other, 1 in a car crash and 2 by suicide, raising alarm from families who believed the hypnosis may have caused psychological harm. Investigators never proved a direct link to the deaths, but Kenney was charged with practicing hypnosis without a license, pleaded no contest, and resigned in 2012. Lawsuits from the victims' families ended in settlements, while Kenney quietly left Florida and withdrew from public life, leaving the controversy unresolved. John C. Woods, the U.S. Army hangman who carried out the executions of Nazis at the Nuremberg trials, completely lied about his qualifications to get the job, claiming prior experience as an executioner when none of it could later be verified. As a result of his incompetence, several condemned Nazi officials did not die from a clean neck break, which is the intended outcome of a properly calculated drop. Instead, multiple prisoners slowly strangled in agony, some taking up to 20 minutes to die while witnesses observed visible suffering. Despite complaints from observers, Woods continued performing executions and was never formally disciplined for the botched hangings. In 1981, David Kerwin was driving through Yellowstone's hot springs with his friend Ronald Ratcliffe and Ronald's dog Moosey. At some point, they parked their car for a better look, but Moosey suddenly jumped into one of the hot springs and started yelping. Even though many people warned him not to jump into the near boiling water, David dove straight in and attempted to rescue the suffering dog. He grabbed Moosey and made it close to the edge before letting go and sinking until his friend pulled him back out. Immediately afterwards, David muttered, "That was stupid. How bad am I? That was a stupid thing I did." He was immediately blinded since the hot spring had melted his eyeballs, and when someone helped to pull his shoe off, his skin came off with it. He sustained third-degree burns over 100% of his body and died the next day after living his final hours in agonizing pain. Sadly, Moosey the dog also did not survive. If Barbie were a real person, she wouldn't be capable of lifting up her own head and would have to walk on all fours due to her proportions. She would be severely anorexic and suffer from chronic diarrhea due to only having room for a few inches of intestines and half a liver. At some point during the Middle Ages, it was believed that sperm produced by the left testicle resulted in having a girl. So to ensure having a son, men would sometimes have it removed. Here's a photo of anti-war demonstrators protesting outside the 1968 DNC in Chicago. Shirtless protester Frank Plata was later drafted by the U.S. Army and killed during the Vietnam War. When Japan executes criminals by hanging, 3 different buttons on the wall are pressed by 3 different people at the same time. This is so that none of them know who actually did the killing, since only one button is randomly programmed to open the trap door. This was the moment an airport security worker in the Philippines swallowed $300 in cash to avoid being arrested. The money had allegedly been taken from a passenger's bag during a routine screening, and when the traveler reported it missing, airport staff confronted the employee as cameras were rolling. Her bizarre attempt to hide the evidence quickly went viral online, prompting officials to suspend her from duty while an investigation moved forward. Here's the before and after of an imperial crown left mangled following the 2025 Louvre heist, where thieves forced it through a narrow slit cut into its reinforced display case, crushing the delicate gold frame as they pulled it free. During the escape, the damaged crown was dropped just outside of the museum and quickly recovered by authorities, though it had been badly deformed from being forced out and striking the ground. The Louvre has since formed a restoration committee and begun seeking proposals to fix it, with early estimates starting around $50,000, though officials say the real cost will come from the painstaking hours of delicate repair needed to rebuild the 170-year-old piece. Princess Diana didn't die immediately at the scene of her car accident, but instead died 5 hours later due to a tear in the pulmonary vein of her heart. She would have had an 80% chance of surviving the crash if she had just been wearing her seatbelt.
Male genital transplant surgeons typically exclude the testicles when performing a transplant. This is because the deceased donor would become the biological father of any future babies produced by that nutsack.
In 2018, American missionary John Allen Chow illegally traveled to North Sentinel Island so that he could preach Christianity to an uncontacted tribe. He was well aware that the Sentinelese people were extremely violent towards outsiders, but he believed that God would protect him. Before he even stepped foot on land, he was greeted with an arrow through the heart. Here's a 1997 photo of Las Vegas police facing Mike Tyson after he'd just bitten off the ear of Evander Holyfield during a boxing match. Tyson claimed he was in a primal, blacked-out state and literally wanted to kill his opponent. In 2013, a Brazilian woman confessed to lacing her cooter with poison so that her husband would die after going down on her. This fox drowned in a frozen lake and was cut out and displayed as a warning for people to keep off the ice. Just last week, an 88-year-old Frenchman caused an entire hospital to be evacuated for the strangest of reasons. He had a shell from World War I stuck inside of his anus, which the hospital considered to be a bomb threat, and a defusing team was called in. They determined the shell was not at risk of exploding, and it was surgically removed by doctors. Takeru Kobayashi, the competitive eater who helped popularize modern eating contests, said he stepped away from competition after years of extreme training left him disconnected from normal hunger. In recent interviews, he's explained that he rarely feels hunger and sometimes even forgets to eat, saying he envies people whose bodies still send basic appetite signals. Kobayashi suggested that constantly forcing himself beyond fullness may have dulled the body's natural warning system, with doctors noting that long-term competitive eating can distort hunger cues and place lasting stress on the body's digestive system. In December of 1984, 12-year-old Janelle Matthews disappeared from her home in Greeley, Colorado, after returning from a school concert, leaving behind signs that she'd been taken from the house. For decades, the case went unsolved until construction workers discovered her remains in 2019, 15 miles away from where she disappeared. Investigators soon focused on former neighbor Stephen Pankey, who'd repeatedly inserted himself into public discussions about the case and referenced it several times while running for governor of Idaho. Prosecutors said his own statements and changing stories helped tie him to the crime. In 2022, Pankey was convicted of kidnapping and murder and later sentenced to life in prison. Back in June, a 3-year-old boy named Riker Webb wandered off from his family's yard in Montana and went missing in the wilderness for 2 days. This photo was taken when he was miraculously found alive in a shed more than 2 miles away from his home. Authorities say he was extremely lucky considering the valley he was found in is riddled with mountain lions and bears. In the heat of COVID, an Asian man was arrested for training his pit bull to drop bricks on people who rang his doorbell. Attack of the Dead Men was a World War I battle during which the Germans bombarded the Russians with a mixture of poisonous gases. The effects were so devastating that the Russians coughed up pieces of their own organs and their skin started dissolving. The zombie-like appearance was so horrifying to the 7,000 Germans that they gave up the battle and ran. In 1983, professional climber Dan Goodwin illegally climbed the North Tower of the World Trade Center. He said he was trying to bring attention to the inability to rescue trapped occupants of the upper levels of skyscrapers. In August of 2001, actor James Woods reported 4 suspicious men on his flight, but authorities didn't take his claims seriously. Turns out there were 4 of the hijackers who would go on to crash into the World Trade Center, and this was one of their test runs. Afghan resistance leader Ahmad Shamu Sood warned about a major terrorist attack that was about to happen on U.S. soil, but he ended up being assassinated just 2 days before 9/11. An FBI counterterrorism expert John O'Neill urged the federal government to take the threat of Al-Qaeda more seriously, but he was eventually pushed into early retirement due to disagreements with the Bureau. He went on to head security at the World Trade Center, where he was killed on 9/11. Seth MacFarlane and Mark Wahlberg were both booked to fly on American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center. But Wahlberg decided last minute to fly to Toronto instead, while MacFarlane missed the flight by 10 minutes due to a hangover. Released in June of 2000, video game Deus Ex didn't include the World Trade Center in its skyline due to technical limitations. The in-game explanation was that they were destroyed in a terrorist attack. In August of 2000, the band Dream Theater recorded a live studio album called Live Scenes from New York. The album cover art features the New York City skyline with the Twin Towers on fire. Most disturbingly, the album was quickly pulled from shelves after coincidentally being released on September 11, 2001. Only one non-military plane was allowed to fly after all commercial flights were forced to land. It was delivering antivenom to a snake handler in Florida who was bitten by the highly venomous taipan snake. Sculptor Michael Richards was killed in his art studio on the 92nd floor of the North Tower on 9/11. His art ironically focused on planes, including a sculpture of airplanes piercing a cast of his own body. This iconic photograph of 28-year-old Marcy Borders covered in dust was taken just after the World Trade Center collapsed. Marcy was a bank teller who worked on the 81st floor of the North Tower. She survived the collapse but sadly died from cancer in 2014, likely caused by the toxic fumes she was exposed to. The only off-duty NYPD officer who was killed in 9/11 had signed his retirement papers that morning, but instead of leaving his badge, John William Perry decided to pick it up one last time. Here's a photo of Pork Chop the search dog receiving fluids and comfort before returning to his duties. Many 9/11 rescue dogs were becoming depressed because they weren't finding any live bodies. Rescue workers had to constantly bury themselves to trick the dogs into thinking they were actually saving someone. Tanya Head was a well-known 9/11 survivor who faked being in the South Tower during the attacks. She served as president of the World Trade Center Survivors Network for years until it was revealed she wasn't even in the country on 9/11. Known as the Midair, this was the result of 5 floors of the World Trade Center being compressed together after the towers collapsed. It's not known if there are any human remains inside. Long after the cleanup, body parts were still being recovered. In 2006, the arm of a victim was found on the roof of a nearby bank. And as recently as 2013, fragments of human remains were discovered on top of a Manhattan rooftop more than a decade after the attacks. In 2002, a 15-year-old boy became inspired by the terrorist attacks on 9/11. He decided to steal an airplane and fly it into a building in Tampa, Florida. It ended up only damaging one office room, and he was the only person that died. Since 9/11, more than 40,000 people have been diagnosed with cancers and chronic illnesses linked to the toxic dust released when the towers collapsed, a debris cloud made up of pulverized concrete, asbestos, fuel, and materials from office equipment and lighting systems. More first responders have died from 9/11 related illnesses than on the actual day of 9/11. Even nearly 25 years after the attacks, victims of 9/11 are still being identified. In 2025, 3 more people were named through advanced DNA testing using tiny fragments recovered from the World Trade Center site. But of the 2,977 victims, 1,100 of them still have no identified remains. Between 2014 and 2015, Ohio woman Brittany Pilkington was responsible for the deaths of 3 of her children, all infant sons, over a 13-month span. The first child's death was initially ruled a case of SIDS, but suspicions grew after a second infant died under similar circumstances. Doctors briefly considered a possible genetic condition, and despite investigations, the youngest boy was returned home only to also die a few days later. One of her children, the only daughter, was never harmed. In police questioning, Brittany confessed to deliberately smothering all 3. She described restraining the older one by holding his legs during the struggle until he went limp after a few minutes. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a long history of trauma surrounding the family. Brittany was repeatedly beaten by her biological father as a child, and even worse, her husband was her former stepfather, whom she said had groomed and sexually abused her starting at the age of 9 before she eventually married him as a teenager. In 2018, she pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2004, a Georgia man was found naked and beaten unconscious next to a dumpster behind a Burger King. He didn't have any possessions or ID on him and couldn't even remember his own name. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he recognized himself but realized he was about 20 years older than he thought. For the next decade, authorities struggled to identify the man despite TV coverage and a nationwide effort. Given the alias Benjamin Kyle, the man was unable to obtain employment without his social security number and therefore became homeless for several years. It wasn't until 2015 when he was finally identified through DNA testing as William Burgess Powell, born in 1948. But despite this discovery, there's still a 20-year gap in his life history with no documented records or anything he can remember. This pic shows Thomas Whitaker on the right celebrating his college graduation with his mom Patricia and brother Kevin. But in reality, Thomas flunked out of school and devised a plan so that his family would never find out. When they returned home the same night this photo was taken, a gunman hired by Thomas ambushed the family, killing Kevin and Patricia and wounding the father Ken. Thomas was initially sentenced to death for the 2 murders, but in 2018 he was spared just 40 minutes before his execution. Turns out his father forgave him and requested for his only remaining family member to not be executed. In 1991, Nigerian prophet Daniel Abadunrin apparently wanted to recreate the story of Daniel in the Bible. So he broke into a lion cage at the zoo with the belief that God wouldn't allow them to open their mouths. But as soon as the lions saw Daniel, they tore him to shreds. In the summer of 2021, 40-year-old Jerry Smith was posing on Tinder as a woman named Angie Renee when he met 18-year-old football player Isemimen Itute. After they got together and went all the way with each other, Itute realized that Angie was a man. That's when the 6'3" linebacker stomped and beat the man to death. Just earlier this year, he was acquitted of all murder charges. This photo from the early 1900s shows nurses standing with mentally ill patients wrapped in wet linens. This treatment method was thought to be calming for patients, despite many of them constantly screaming to get out. Here's a 1989 photo of South African spear fisherman Gerjo van Niekerk showing off his recent bite mark from a great white. He told reporters, quote, "It was a 1 in a million freak accident." While diving near Cape Town just 2 months afterwards, Gerjo went missing until his shark-bitten leg washed ashore a few days later. Jordan James Park, the British influencer known as the Lip King, has died at age 34 after a suspected complication linked to a cosmetic procedure. Park gained notoriety for spending more than $150,000 on surgeries and even appeared on the reality show Botched, where doctors warned him about the risks tied to extreme fillers and repeated operations. Police are currently treating his death as unexplained, while a man and woman were arrested on suspicion of manslaughter as the investigation continues. The case has quickly sparked renewed discussion about the dangers of unregulated cosmetic work and the overwhelming pressure created by online beauty trends. In October of 2011, 2-year-old Wang Yu wandered into a market street in Foshan, China, where she was struck by a van and left critically injured in the road. Surveillance footage later showed dozens of pedestrians and drivers passing by without intervening before a second truck ran her over. After several minutes, a female waste collector finally moved her to safety, but the child tragically died a few hours later from her injuries. The case sparked worldwide debate about bystander behavior, public responsibility, and the social pressures that may discourage people from intervening in emergencies. This one made me puke. A female orangutan named Pony was used as a sex slave in a village on the Asian island of Borneo. She was shaved and chained to a bed daily, and whenever a man approached her, she would automatically assume a submissive position. In 1965, a device was patented to deliver a baby using centrifugal force. The machine would spin around until the baby popped out, which would then be caught in a net. An armadillo's armor is so tough that a Texas man once shot at one on his property and the bullet ricocheted back, hitting the man in the face. In 1951, New Zealand author Janet Frame was diagnosed with schizophrenia and was scheduled for a lobotomy. But just days before the operation, she won New Zealand's most prestigious literary award, prompting doctors to cancel the operation that would mash her brain. Actor Mickey Rourke was a heartthrob of the 1980s until he quit his acting career to become a boxer. But after multiple facial injuries and botched plastic surgeries, he now looks like he's wearing a mask of someone else's face. Earlier last year, an Alabama man was arrested for criminal littering after putting flowers on the grave of his fiancée who died in a car crash in 2021. While filming an episode of Storage Wars, Daryl Sheets once discovered a dead body wrapped in plastic. Police later determined that the previous owner had murdered his wife and locked her body in a storage unit. Serial killer Edmund Kemper became friends with the very police officers that were investigating him. They called him Big Ed at the local bar and never would have suspected him in 1,000 years. When he initially confessed to being a serial killer, they laughed at him because they thought he was pulling a prank. Octomom Nadia Suleman became notorious in 2009 when she had 8 babies as a result of in vitro fertilization. However, Nadia claimed that while she was heavily sedated, it was her fertility specialist that convinced her to have 12 embryos implanted in her at once. All of the babies miraculously survived, but the doctor had his license revoked for extreme malpractice. This violin was used by the lead member of the band that played on the Titanic. Just like in the movie, they continued playing as the ship went down. Prior to filming The Dark Knight, Heath Ledger locked himself in a hotel room and talked to only himself for 6 straight weeks. He said this helped him land more in the realm of a psychopath to prepare for his iconic role of the Joker. Many believe this extreme dedication was partially responsible for his accidental overdose on sleeping pills the next year. A horrific bungee cord injury caused this man's iris to completely collapse. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma used to be the wealthiest black community in all of America. That was until 1921 when a mob of white supremacists attacked the community with the help of the National Guard. Using guns, explosives, and even airplanes, they decimated 35 square blocks of the neighborhood and murdered hundreds of African Americans. It's known today as the Black Wall Street Massacre. The short-faced bear was once the most abundant bear in all of North America until it went extinct around 11,000 BC. Some scientists argue that these massive bears delayed human migration into North America because they kept killing men trying to cross the Bering Strait. Heart Attack Grill is a restaurant in Las Vegas where customers over 350 pounds eat for free. The only vegan option on the menu is cigarettes, and up to 3 people have died from heart attacks while eating there. In 1940, Walt Disney hired 11 little people to dress up as Pinocchio and wave to people at the movie's premiere. He left them on a theater balcony with enough food and wine for the day, but there was no way for them to get down. By late afternoon, they had all taken off their thick, sweaty costumes and were naked, drunk, and swearing at parents and their children. According to his former doctor, Michael Jackson's father had him chemically castrated as a young boy. He reportedly did this so that Michael would maintain his high-pitched singing voice into adulthood. The skin of certain fish species can be grafted onto severe burns and diabetic wounds. The material recruits the body's own cells and is eventually converted into living tissue. Located in Paris, this is the tomb of legendary scientist Marie Curie. It's lined with an inch thick of lead since her remains are still radioactive to this day. A Nile crocodile named Gustave has killed as many as 300 people in Burundi over the last 50 years. He's evaded dozens of capture and murder attempts as he can be identified by the 3 bullet scars on his body. The 2,000-pound monster croc is already nearly 20 feet long and is said to be still growing to this day. This iconic photograph of 28-year-old Marcy Borders covered in dust was taken just after the World Trade Center collapsed on 9/11. Marcy was a bank teller who worked on the 81st floor of the North Tower. She survived the collapse, but sadly died from cancer in 2014, likely caused by the toxic fumes she was exposed to. This is the gravestone of H.R. Giger, the Swiss artist and sculptor who designed the creatures for the movie Alien. On a British Airways flight in 1995, a woman was complaining of chest pain, so 2 doctors came over to check on her. They quickly realized she was suffering from a punctured lung and required immediate surgery. But the problem was they couldn't land for help since the increase in air pressure could kill her. So they performed midair surgery on her using a coat hanger, silverware, and a bottle of cognac for sterilization. Within 10 minutes, they'd saved her life. For 24 years, Missouri woman Gypsy Blanchard pretended that her daughter Gypsy had multiple chronic conditions. She claimed her daughter suffered from leukemia, asthma, muscular dystrophy, and had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old. Dee forced her to stay in a wheelchair and act disabled, subjecting her to many unnecessary surgeries and medications. Gypsy was often fed through a feeding tube and supplied air through an oxygen tank. Her mother also regularly shaved the girl's head to give her the appearance of a cancer patient. Whenever Gypsy suggested that she wasn't actually sick, her mother would physically harm her. In 2015, Gypsy was finally tired of her mother's horrific abuse and sent her boyfriend to stab Dee 17 times in the back. Today, Gypsy is still serving out her 10-year sentence after pleading guilty to second-degree murder of her abusive mother. In 2003, a skeleton measuring 6 inches long was found in a remote part of Chile's Atacama desert. Due to its elongated skull and rather developed bones considering its size, the specimen was initially rumored to be an alien. But after extensive testing, scientists determined that it was more likely the skeleton of a stillborn human girl that had close to 70 different genetic mutations. According to a recent study, people in the US who were born before 1996 have a slightly lower IQ than those born afterwards. This is due to the negative effects of leaded gasoline, which was finally banned completely on January 1st, 1996. In 1924, gifted college students Leopold and Loeb planned out the perfect murders simply to demonstrate their superior intellectual abilities. But after kidnapping and murdering a child, they left an abundance of evidence and were swiftly convicted of murder. This 1994 photo shows O.J. Simpson holding hands with his children at the funeral of their mother and his ex-wife, Nicole Simpson Brown. She was brutally stabbed to death, most likely by O.J. himself, even though he was famously acquitted in court a few months later. During the funeral, O.J. reportedly spent a significant amount of time with Nicole's body and was even seen kissing her on the lips. Up until 1974, it was illegal to appear in public in the city of Chicago if you were ugly, and each offense was subject to a fine. The law was primarily made to prevent people with disabilities from going outside. While on his deathbed and completely unable to speak due to throat cancer, famous author Aldous Huxley wrote his final request to his wife to be given 100 micrograms of LSD. So she injected him with 2 separate doses of acid, and he died just a few hours later while tripping balls. Morbid Facts, Part 303. When Eminem was a heavy user, he would swallow handfuls of pills without even knowing what they were. In 2007, he once overdosed on so much methadone that doctors informed him he was only 2 hours away from dying. It was such a wake-up call that he quit drugs almost immediately and has remained sober ever since. American soldier Henry Gunther was the last man to die during World War I. At 10:59 a.m. on November 11, 1918, he bravely charged at a German roadblock filled with armed soldiers. The Germans tried waving him off, knowing that the armistice would be signed within a few moments. But he apparently got too close, fired a couple rounds, and was killed instantly. In 1959, a white man named John Howard Griffin disguised himself as a black man and traveled through the Deep South for 6 weeks. After writing a book about his experiences with racism, he was forced to move to Mexico for several years due to the barrage of death threats. Albert Einstein died at the age of 76 after refusing to undergo surgery on his heart. He was quoted saying, "I want to go when I want. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share, it's time to go. I will do so elegantly." In September of 1974, 18-year-old Mila Kokostick was lured to a 12th-floor apartment by 5 men who attempted to assault her. When given the chance, she decided to jump from the apartment window and fell about 120 feet onto a cafe awning below. She died 2 days later, but was conscious for long enough to give police a full description of the awful incident. Nicknamed the Merchant of Death, Russian arms dealer Victor Bout rose to power after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Using his fleet of 60 cargo planes, the arms he's brokered have helped fuel conflicts in countries including Afghanistan, Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, Rwanda, Liberia, Sudan, and Sierra Leone. Willing to sell weapons to anyone who wanted them, Bout has supplied both sides of multiple civil wars and is said to be responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. He was arrested during a sting operation in 2008 where he was caught selling surface-to-air missiles that would have been used to kill American troops. But Victor Bout is now free thanks to a prisoner swap for WNBA player Brittany Griner, who was arrested 6 months ago after trying to bring a THC cartridge on a Russian airplane. Shortly after returning from the moon, Buzz Aldrin fell into deep depression and addiction. He was quoted saying, "I wanted to resume my duties, but there are no duties to resume. There was no goal, no sense of calling, no project worth pouring myself into." Police in Pakistan are searching for a religious healer who reportedly convinced a pregnant woman that hammering a 2-inch nail into her skull would help her give birth to a boy. The woman became desperate after her husband threatened to divorce her if she gave birth to another girl for the 4th time. Lucy Studi from Iowa claims that her late father was a serial killer who murdered up to 70 women throughout the 70s and 80s. She told authorities that the man forced his kids to help bury the bodies, many of them thrown into a well that's since been filled in. Police aren't exactly sure how to approach it, especially since Lucy's sister says she's lying about the whole thing. Japan has always been known for its wacky game shows, but in 1998, one particular show took this to the extreme. A man nicknamed Nasubi was selected to be locked inside of an apartment with nothing but a supply of water and thousands of magazines. He was challenged to enter mail-in sweepstakes until he won about $10,000 in prizes, but he was given no food, no clothes, and no form of human contact. His only means of survival were the items he won from the magazines. The man was told it was only experimental and that he was to record himself for a later broadcast. But in reality, his entire experience was live-streamed to an audience of tens of millions of people to watch and make fun of. There were times when Nasubi went weeks without food and was fortunate to win items such as dog food and uncooked rice. On one occasion, he won a can of spaghetti after starving for days, but he couldn't eat it since he didn't have a can opener. When Nasubi would break down mentally and cry in front of the camera, the show's producers would play a laugh track to the audience so that they would find it funny. After 355 days of pure isolation and torture, Nasubi had achieved his goal, but the show had become far too popular for producers to end. So in the middle of the night, he was blindfolded and taken to a new apartment, where he was given the task of winning enough magazine prizes to win a plane ticket back home. This goal was revised several times to the point where it took Nasubi an extra 3 months to finally win the game show. He was again blindfolded and brought to a final apartment where the walls suddenly dropped and he was met with a massive live audience. Still naked and confused, Nasubi would soon realize that his endeavors were live broadcasted the entire time. The entire experiment lasted about 15 months in total. And the horrific show broke many TV records with a peak of about 17 million viewers each night. For months and even years after the ordeal, Nasubi reported being uncomfortable in clothing and struggled heavily with human interaction. After having an allergic reaction to asthma medicine in 2009, Tennessee woman Shanina Isom has been suffering from a mysterious skin condition that causes her to grow fingernails in place of her hair. In 2004, 200 women armed with kitchen knives stormed into an Indian courthouse before stabbing and murdering Akuya Dav, a gang leader, serial killer, and rapist who kept escaping his sentencing due to bribes. Every single woman later claimed responsibility for killing him. This photo of Sean and Michael McQuilkin was taken at Sequoia National Park just seconds before they were struck by lightning in 1975. All three, including their photographer sister, survived the strike, but younger brother Sean suffered third-degree burns and spent nearly 6 months in a coma. Troy Hurtubise devoted his life to developing a suit that could fend off a grizzly bear, and was even permitted to go one-on-one with a 320-pound female grizzly. But sadly, he died in a car explosion just days before he was able to test out the design. It's rumored that when a pope dies, it's tradition to hit him in the head with a silver hammer to ensure that he's dead and not just sleeping. A pet Sphinx cat named Jazzy Purrs had to have both her eyes removed and now looks like a spooky skeleton cat. During a soccer match in 1989, 96 people were killed at Hillsborough Stadium in England after being crushed due to overcrowding, many of whom died while standing up. 22 years later, Stephen Whittle became the 97th victim. He had sold his ticket to a friend who ended up dying during the disaster. When a predatory producer assaulted one of her friends, Carrie Fisher sent him a Tiffany box with a severed cow tongue inside. She also left a note inside that read, "The next delivery will be something of yours in a much smaller box." When Britain changed the packaging of Tylenol to blister packs instead of bottles, the suicide rate from Tylenol declined by nearly 50%. Anyone who wanted a lethal dose of 50 pills now had to push them out one by one instead of easily dumping them out from a bottle. In 2013, a 60-year-old Japanese truck driver found out he was accidentally switched at birth in a Tokyo hospital in 1953. His biological parents were very wealthy, and the infant who took his place grew up to own a successful real estate company. Meanwhile, the original son was raised by a poor single mother and struggled with poverty throughout his entire life.